Review Chapter 28, the nervous system. Section 1 discusses the three overlapping functions of any nervous system, of any organism, of any animal. They are sensory input, integration, and motor output. This can be illustrated by the use of a reflex. So for example, reflexes, there's a sensory receptor in the leg that is stretched when you tap the patellar ligament, sends information to the spinal cord integrates that information, then a motor neuron sends it back to the leg to contract it. That's called a knee-jerk reflex. Section 2 discusses the main functional unit of a nervous system. These are the neurons or nerve cells. Here is a drawing of a neuron. You have a cell body, which has most of the cytoplasm. You have these small branching extensions called dendrites, and you have a long extension called an axon. Now, in most axons, they're surrounded by other cells, such as Schwann cells, which I've drawn in red, or oligodendrocytes. They form a myelin sheath around the axon. That helps the nerve impulse travel that length. Sections 3 and 4 and 5 discuss functions of neurons. Now with resting membrane potential, that is what the nerve is maintaining when it is not sending an impulse. Now to illustrate resting membrane potential, it has to do with the fact that the membrane itself has charges inside and outside. So there's an excess of positively charged ions out of the membrane and an excess of negatively charged ions on the inside of the membrane. Now in terms of ions, the outside you have high sodium, low potassium. Inside you have low sodium and high potassium. And you also have negatively charged proteins. The sodium-potassium pump, which is active transport, maintains the status quo. Now, if you were to put a voltmeter to this nerve, you would register a voltage of minus 70 millivolts. It maintains a minus 70 millivolt, about 5% of that of a flashlight battery. Now, the action potential, section 4, describes the nervous impulse. You need to be studying your notes along with figure 28.4 for this to make sense to you. Now, here we have the graph at minus 70. Both the sodium and potassium channels, these are membrane proteins, they're closed. If you stimulate the nerve to threshold, then you get your entire impulse. Now, during this depolarization phase, the sodium channels open, sodium diffuses into the cell, the inside becomes more positive, and the curve goes up. Then when it reaches about plus 35, it switches over. The sodium channels close, potassium channels open. Potassium is going to diffuse out. So when positive charges are leaving the cell becomes more negative and the curve goes back down. Now at this point, the membrane has been repolarized, but the ions are backwards. The sodium-potassium pump switches them back again, restores resting state. Now the entire neuron does not depolarize at once. It travels down the length of the axon. So we'll start on this end and literally travel down that way. Kind of analogous to a stadium wave traveling around the length of a stadium. Now, neurons do not touch each other. In the brain and in the spinal cord, there are tiny spaces in between neurons called synapses. And neurotransmitters are chemicals that function at synapses. Now, of course, neurotransmitters are released into the synapse when the nerve impulse reaches the synapse. This will cause the next nerve cell to respond accordingly. Sometimes it's a new nerve impulse, sometimes it inhibits one. Now, section 9 discusses the action of drugs. Read your notes about the effects of stimulants and depressants, and there's some examples provided. Basically, drugs work by affecting the action of neurotransmitters and synapses. Now, starting from section 10, we go into animal nervous systems. There are diagrams of different types of invertebrates in that section. Flatworms have what's called a ladder-type nervous system, but small cnidarians like hydra and jellyfish don't even have a brain. They have what's called a nerve net, a loose network of nerves throughout the body. Leeches and insects have a ventral nerve cord, although that's not well illustrated in your textbook. And we, that is vertebrates, have a dorsal nerve cord running along the dorsal or back part of the body. Starting with section 11, it discusses the human nervous system. Central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, all the nerves coming off the brain and spinal cord. Now your central nervous system has the gray matter and the white matter. Gray matter consists of all of the cell bodies, or nearly all of the cell bodies in your body. The white matter are these myelinated axons. Now your peripheral nervous system is basically bundles of axons. So axons going to your feet are connected to cell bodies in your spinal cord. That's how long these things can get in the human body. Now, section 12 discusses the peripheral nervous system. Study the notes on that. The peripheral nervous system involves sensory nerves and motor nerves. Motor nerves involve the somatic or voluntary part and the autonomic part, which is involuntary. Now, the involuntary or autonomic nervous system controls such functions as unconscious breathing, heart rate, and things like that. It is subdivided into the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. There's a detailed diagram in your book. But to get down to the common denominator, the parasympathetic division is involved in resting and digestion, and the sympathetic nervous system is involved in activity and stress. These are acting on the same organ systems, shifting constantly as need be. Sections 14 and 15 discuss the human brain. Now, in your notes and in your book, it goes over the parts of the brain. Now, to use this as an illustration, we can start off with the brainstem. The brainstem has centers for autonomic function. They include the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is for coordination of movement. The thalamus here is to serve as a relay station. It sorts information, sends it to other parts of the brain. The hypothalamus, major homeostasis center, biological clock, controls nervous system, and so forth. Now, the big wrinkly part that everybody thinks of as brain is the cerebrum of the brain, which discusses higher brain centers. Section 15. Now, the cerebrum is in two cerebral hemispheres and divided into lobes. The frontal lobe in the front, the parietal lobe at top, occipital lobe to the side, in the back, and the temporal lobe to the side. Now, in your textbook, it shows you some of the details that has been discovered in terms of functions of parts of the brain. So you have a prefrontal cortex, which deals with smart analytical stuff. You have the motor cortex, which controls voluntary movement. Now, you have some other things too. In the parietal lobe, you've got the somatosensory cortex. It registers sense of touch and so forth. An association area, which helps you interpret that sensation. A few other things too. Occipital lobe has a visual center and a visual association center. The temporal lobe deals with things like hearing and the sense of smell. The limbic system is the emotional part of the brain. It deals with emotions and memory. I say part, it's really a system of parts. There's a drawing of the limbic system in the book. It discusses the links between memory and emotions and even the sense of smell. So this concludes our review of this chapter.